It's another Thursday night, and I am S.K. Barrett, your host for Real Monsters. Joining me, if I don't choke on my last bite of pizza, is the lovely and talented Wes Hobrick.
Hello, hello, hello. I do apologize if there are any issues tonight. My Skype keeps crashing on the computer. You know what? It
Uh,
just occurred to me there was a Windows update that I didn't want that went through last night. I wonder if
oh,
that is what did it.
mm, they're punishing you for not updating.
It probably, absolutely, positively, just horrible. Uh, but yeah, and we are here on a another, well, almost anniversary of an infamous crime. You're
Yeah, really
talking about
close.
yeah, you're talking about the wee hours of November 15th, 60 years ago, when what we will be talking about happened.
Yeah.
So, yep.
Uh, let's, it's not, this is not the worst show that we've done before, but I'm going to go ahead and throw the warning up just in case.
Good
There's
idea.
This is this is not for kids. Okay.
Mhm.
um, yeah,
Yep.
we have some crime scene photos that are could be considered graphic, and we will talk about some pretty nasty shit. So if you don't like that stuff, what the hell are you doing here? Go somewhere else. Go watch Disney Plus or something like that.
Yeah, get your cultural warnings off of that.
That's
But
right.
yeah.
They have their own
Um,
warnings.
Yeah, hi, Michelle. We were briefly talking in the chat on the Real Monsters Facebook page. Michelle had some interesting things to say, but
Yeah.
yeah,
All right.
because
So
it's not,
do we have any history besides what we're actually going to talk about?
just a few interesting things on the page. I don't know if people saw this, but up around Chicago, actually, Kim Fox, the district attorney that kind of botched the whole Jussie Smollett thing and took a lot of heat for it.
Botch is a very generous term. Um,
Yeah, I am
Paid
being a
off
little
seems a little
generous.
more accurate.
But at any rate, up in her office, up around Cook County, they just swore in a therapy dog to help child victims of sexual assault specifically, which I thought was pretty cool.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think so too. Most definitely. Um, let's see. There was an Alabama man got $10 million after it. Well, his family got $10 million after his death at being left in a jail cell. They apparently drugged this poor guy around when he was complaining of um, some issues with his neck. Drug him from cell to cell. So it's
Until
horrible,
he
but
died.
yeah, basically. And then you have the woman out in California got a bucket of hot diarrhea dumped on her head. Uh, yeah.
So was that included in her travel package, or did she pay extra for that?
I don't know.
I want the
I
full
don't know.
California experience.
Yeah, basically. And I had to label that one on the page not satire, just so people know.
Yeah,
Um,
it's so hard to tell these days.
yeah, and I'm not even sure what exactly you would charge that guy with. And if it
Well,
were spit, like,
that, that could be considered reckless endangerment and assault.
yeah, I was just thinking that if he were to spit on a officer, they would charge him with assault. So, um, but yeah, I mean, yeah, it seems things are getting pretty absurd out there in quite a lot of areas. And that is really all I had in the way of news for right now. So
Good, because we got plenty to go off of here.
we do. We definitely do. Um, oh, Michelle says in the chat somewhere I have some legal documents. She had a really interesting post on the page about the Clutters,
Yeah, yeah,
which I was
fascinating
just
stuff.
going for that to read it. Let's see. Worked at the Garden City Telegram newspaper for a time and actually lived within sight of the house for a while. So that's pretty interesting because the house out there where the four Clutter family members were murdered is still standing. They actually built the thing about, I think, 11 years before um,
The yeah, and
crime.
the police department there in Garden City has their own article about this case.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, they have quite a lot about it. And, it's interesting because there's a lot of artifacts that stretch pretty far out west with it. Las Vegas PD was very influential in how Perry Smith and Dick Hickok were ultimately caught. So um,
Well,
they,
let's dive into this shit. It sounds pretty fun. Well, not
it,
fun, but you know what I mean.
I think it's interesting how it sort of affected the psyche of the American people. When you
Yeah,
look at it, it's really the first home invasion that was caught and I guess you could say amplified by mass media.
right.
And, um, I just sort of went from there. People got scared and they got more and more scared as the years go on with this. And it's interesting because I think the home invasions kind of get more brutal with how it's been covered too. Um, Michael Stone, who we've talked quite a bit about on this show, the forensic psychiatrist with the 22-point scale of evil, he was talking a bit about Hickok and Smith and how, like we were saying, their crime was kind of subdued, especially when you compare it to the 2007 Pettit home invasion out in Connecticut. Dr. Stephen Pettit, his house was invaded by two guys, like in Holcomb, Kansas, um, and they knocked the doctor unconscious. They
Oh,
forced his wife to withdraw 15K from their bank account. Then they brutally raped her and the 11-year-old daughter before setting them and the house on fire.
Jesus.
So,
Couldn't you call Villisca a home invasion?
um, I would suppose so. Although, I guess kind of when I think of home invasion, it's more money. It revolves more around a
Okay,
robbery motive.
gotcha.
But I mean, maybe I'm wrong in saying that, but
No,
you
I think uh, I think there's some accuracy to that statement.
know, yeah.
I mean, when I do home invasions, that's why I do it.
Well, there you go. But yeah, I mean, you know,
I'll edit that
the
out later.
the the Clutter family out there in western Kansas, because that's where we're talking about. We're talking about roughly 70 miles from the Colorado border. And I think I
Oh
put
man,
in
that
a
is
map for our graphics.
you did not.
Oh, really?
Yeah, where
Oh,
the
I
hell's
meant
the
to.
map? I love maps.
My apologies there. I thought I
Oh, you
did.
know what? You did. Somehow it didn't show up in the carousel. Oh, excuse me. Burp.
Oh, that
I-
sucks.
I'll uh I'll get that ready. Oh, it doesn't want to show.
It's weird. But
Yeah,
yeah, we're talking about that.
that whole
Um,
batch that you sent, it just doesn't want to
it
open up.
didn't.
It doesn't want to open up.
Uh, okay. Well, we're talking about that close to Colorado and also close to Oklahoma. So the southwest part of the state, as we
Let
were
me get.
saying.
Yeah, I'll get my own image of a map up
Okay.
there. 'Cause I think it's good to see.
Yeah. The Clutters, they were very active in the community out there. Herb Clutter, he was 45, and his wife Bonnie was also 45. And then they had several kids, although only two were home at the time of the murder. They had one who was studying nursing in Kansas City, so on the other side of the state. And
Okay.
then they had another one who had moved away as well, but would visit as often as she could. Um, Herb, he made his name as a farmer, as a philanthropist. He was very involved in building the newer Methodist church at the time in nearby Garden City. Um, and that, interestingly, also ties into how fortunate they were with the investigators on this case, which we'll
Oh
get
yeah.
to.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a
Um,
bit.
yeah, and Herb also had experience and was respected actually out in Washington, D.C., where he did something with the federal government and farming. I don't think it was Department of Ag, but it was something that was, allied to those sorts of
Okay.
purposes and helping the policymakers out there. Um, the family was known for being relatively normal, although Bonnie had her issues of what Herb called spells. Um, I don't think it was
Depression or
anything
something like that.
depression, anxiety.
Yeah.
I would hate to call it, hysteria, but that might have still been what they would have called it back then. Um, but she was hospitalized a couple of times for it. But as far as I could tell, it was nothing really major with it, just something she would get from time to time. But yeah, and that, it's the Clutter family. They're really the all American sort of family out here in a town that only had a population of, I think it was only about 100 at the time, because Holcomb was unincorporated back then. It was known for, this sort of gravel drives, a place where everybody keeps their doors unlocked because you
Hmm.
really have, nothing to fear in that sort of place where everybody knows their neighbors. But then comes along these two guys, Richard Eugene Hickok, born 1932, Kansas City, into a family that they weren't really poor, but they weren't really middle class. They kind of rode that sort of line there,
Yeah.
you could say. And they had a farm out in Edgerton, Kansas, that would later become a focus of the investigation, as it were, of a search warrant in particular. But it was while he was behind bars that he was told by another inmate that this Herb Clutter, had a safe on his farm, and he kept around $10,000 in it. And you look at some of these
Oh
other
my God.
sources.
Rumors.
Yeah. Yeah. And you look at some of these other sources, and they basically say that Hickok was badgering this guy because it had me wondering, considering they only found about $50 in that house.
Yeah.
Um, it had me wonder how this guy, who, as Michelle says in the chat, was a former farmhand of Herb Clutter's,
Right.
could get it so wrong in saying, "Oh, he has $10,000," but they only find 50 in the house. That's a pretty big disparity.
Well, you ever play telegraph?
This is true. I
I
mean, this is
mean,
true, but it does kind of eliminate some spots in that sort of chain when you have a guy who worked there.
yeah, but he might have heard that rumor before he worked for them.
Well,
You
yeah,
know,
I suppose. So. But
it could, or he. I mean, there's several explanations. One is he he exaggerated it to get the guy off his ass over this, right? Leave me
mhm,
alone.
shut up,
Yeah,
basically. Yeah.
tell him a story and he'll leave you alone, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Um,
he'll finally just be quiet about it.
right. Uh,
Um,
The other is that maybe he ran across other farmhands who had also worked there, and that was a rumor going around amongst the transitory farmhands, because a lot of them did move from farm to farm, you
Hmm.
know, like they still do this today for planting and picking and
Hmm.
different tasks. Uh,
Oh, in agriculture, and that's
yeah,
Michelle said that Herb was known to use checks for everything. Um, that part's interesting. Another thing I was wondering with that, you had these. It was very common practice in the Great Depression not to put money in banks.
yes, exactly.
Um, I I wonder how many farms around that area where maybe that was still something popular that people would do.
To not use banks.
Hmm.
Oh yeah, I absolutely true. My grandparents all went through the depression, and they were, by the time I came along, they were all used to banks again, but there was definitely a kind of a, there was this dichotomy, this tension between, you know, banks will keep our money safe, and also we
Hmm.
don't trust them.
Right. Yeah,
And
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 what if there's a failure or what
right.
have you? What if
Again,
there's a repeat of the
right.
1930s?
So
But
it was a real challenge for people of that era to fully trust banks. And some people really did never get over it. Some people never got over the things that they went through in the depression, you know. You'd see,
mhm.
and a lot of hoarding came out of that.
Oh yeah, I mean
Hoard,
mattress money,
not just not
as we
just
were talking
money, but
about.
weird shit like jars and lids and boxes and you know just weird shit. I mean, my mom would do that,
Hmm.
like egg cartons and shit, you know, that she would say it was going to be for some creative project, only she never did the creative project, so they just piled up.
Oh, absolutely. And this guy that Hickok was using as a source in plumbing for information, Floyd Wells was the name. I was just flipping through the rest of my notes.
Yeah?
He was actually a farmhand when they built the house on that land. So 1948. And apparently, he said that while they were building that, he saw Herb pay for lumber with large bills and several of them,
Well,
which,
yeah, that doesn't mean he keeps it around, obviously, I mean, looking at it from our distance, we go, well, he knew this order was coming, so he
mhm,
probably went to the bank and got the money.
yeah,
It
oh,
doesn't mean he
absolutely.
just went inside and dug into his, safe.
Hmm. Yeah, just go get some cash from the bank to pay the contractors,
Right.
as it were. Yeah, but yeah, and as they were talking more and more about that, and they brought Perry Smith in on this, Hickok apparently told him that they were going to use any cash proceeds for a deep sea fishing boat in South America. um, although, it's interesting how far they got, but we'll get to that as well after the crime. I think that Hickok honestly has the more interesting history
Okay.
out of him and Perry Smith with these guys because we were talking a bit about his family background there. He was known as a decent kid when he was growing up. For most of it, he was a decent athlete, good student.
Okay.
People liked him. But then when he was 19, he was in a car accident.
Head trauma. Tell me it was head
Yes,
trauma.
it was head trauma.
Damn it. There
Um,
it goes again.
yeah, there it is reappearing. And in
Yeah.
fact, when he was in this accident, his car flipped and he damn near drowned in a puddle too,
Wow.
on top of it. But his family were saying, if you look at it just the way like his eyes, the way that they were set, you could see it. But they also talked a lot about his personality changing to
This
where
is,
he was
yeah,
thinking.
and this is a common thing with head trauma. It's not all regarding Henry shit. You don't go from a. In fact, I would say most head injury victims don't go from an asshole to a super nice, gentle person. It tends to go the other way, where
Mm-hmm.
people get angry and violent.
Yeah. And I think that that is really shown with Hickok the more that we look at him with that. And it was actually something that the shrink who examined him after all this was looking at pretty in depth. But yeah, right after that happened, he starts drinking more. He starts womanizing more. And in fact, he goes through three wives in his young life. I mean, you're
Wow.
talking about a guy who, was executed not long after the crime in his 30s, really. That he goes through three wives, he goes through several jobs, and he ultimately sinks into check kiting and other petty crime. Um,
Yeah,
really.
it's really amazing from a, you know, distant perspective, the kinds of changes that can take place from a brain injury.
Hmm.
It's just astonishing, really, how that wiring can get so fucked up just like that.
Hmm.
Boom. It's
Oh,
a different person.
absolutely. I mean, it really is. I'm sorry, this YouTube is having an issue too, where it's not letting me type anything in the comments.
Oh,
So I'm trying to
I
fix
blocked you
that
from
as
it.
we're trying to fix that as we're talking here too. Um, but yeah, and you had all that going on, and I wonder if it didn't just totally screw his impulse control into the ground, especially.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah, and how it affects you depends a lot on, what area of the brain gets whacked.
mhm. Yeah, and in impulse, it would be the frontal lobes, particularly. But and then Perry Smith also has kind of an interesting background when you look at it. His parents were rodeo folk,
Okay.
and they were really kind of famous in that circuit. Um, his dad was a white guy, and his mother was an Indian. And
Okay.
ultimately, with that, I forget what it was that really precipitated it, but maybe she was promiscuous beforehand, his mother, but she apparently invited a bunch of sailors over to their house when the dad was away.
Hold
So what
on.
does
There's
he
no
do?
sailors in Kansas.
Well, this isn't in Kansas right
Oh,
now. We're
okay.
talking about, I think it was Anchorage, Alaska,
All
when
right.
they were up there.
That makes more sense.
Um, yeah, yeah, Michelle, I do apologize. I am just now getting on there, and I think I'm able to comment now. Let's give it a shot. Um, yeah, I don't know what is up with my technology tonight. It's just horrible. There we go. Now it's showing up.
Yeah.
But yeah, that happened up in Anchorage, and apparently his dad, basically drove them away, and he had some issues with alcohol himself and started beating the mother. Um, and that is when she took Perry and went to San Francisco. And a short time after that, the father was incarcerated. And basically, from there, it just went even more downhill for Perry.
Hmm.
And he ended up in a Catholic school where he suffered quite often from enuresis. So one third of the triad of sociopathy right
Rem-
there.
Suffered from which again?
Bedwetting,
Oh,
enuresis.
God. Just say
But
call it bedwetting. Jesus, we're not scientists here.
but yeah, you had that, and he told the story to a good buddy of his who was a character witness for him at his trial.
Yeah.
It was an army buddy because he served in the army in Korea, although he really didn't see any action. And that's where you got to know this guy. But he was telling the story to him about how the nuns would beat him something unmerciful at this school over his bedwetting.
Ugh,
And in fact, he still
fucking
had a
nuns.
scar on his penis from where apparently they damn near severed it.
What?
Yeah, from the punishment,
God.
ostensibly for, bedwetting.
You know, if priests and nuns weren't part of a church organization, the shit they did would get so many of them thrown in jail.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it happens with a lot of, not excusing Catholicism, but it does happen with a lot of denominations.
Hmm.
But I mean, it's horrible any way you look at it, you know. And that's a whole other rabbit hole about how
Yeah.
they cover it up too.
Yeah, that's a show in itself.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. But
So, how does a rodeo family end up in Anchorage? That's a little, I don't know that you know the answer, but it's kind of curious. I don't think there's a lot of rodeo in Alaska. Maybe there is.
you
I don't
know,
know.
not to my knowledge, I'm not sure how honestly they got up there, but they did live there for a time.
Hmm,
Um, and maybe it would have something to do with the mother's heritage. That
maybe.
could be. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. So that, is basically Perry Smith's history. From there, he turns into, a petty thief. And allegedly, he tells Dick Hickok when he met him that he killed a black guy in 55 over something minor, but there's really no proof of that. He's basically just,
Was he just making shit up to impress him? Is that the thinking?
yeah, I mean, basically with that. And it's because of that that Hickok decides to take him along when they get out of prison
Hmm.
to go and rob the Clutters.
Okay.
Because he had just gotten off of a 5-year stretch for stealing guns and trying to pawn them in Kansas City. So,
Which one? Smith?
Hickok,
Hickok. Okay.
yes. As part of the petty crime, and like I said, a lot of check kiting was his big thing, you know.
So there's no background for either of these guys that anybody, any reasonable person would say is a predictor of what was going to happen.
Um, well, I mean, there is, uh, I think you could find that in there
Really?
to, I mean, to get them into, petty crime and then it ultimately escalating to what happened in Holcomb. I would think with
Well, I mean
Hickok,
the home invasion,
uh,
yes, but not the murders though, right?
oh, well, yeah, I guess you could say that about the murder part.
Yeah.
Um, and when you get to the confessions with that, Hickok allegedly wanted it done purely as a way to wipe him out as witnesses.
Hmm.
But even that rabbit hole gets a bit deeper, as we'll get to with that.
All right,
But
let's get
well,
down that rabbit hole. All
yeah, I mean, we're getting there.
right.
So it's November 15th. They make their way to the house out there after they had heard about it. They gain entry through an office door that was, as we said, unlocked, with Holcomb being Holcomb. Um, everybody knowing each other.
Right.
And they find Mr. Clutter in the
By the way,
house.
in case people find this, I mean, you hear about it, but it really was the case. People didn't lock their doors, especially in the rural areas, because
Yeah.
you just didn't have anybody, strangers just didn't come by. It just didn't happen,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, they didn't. People literally knew everybody around them there.
Yeah,
But yeah, they make their way in there. They find Mr. Clutter, and they ultimately, tie him up and question him about this safe that they think is in there. And he says, "I haven't got a safe." And he ultimately gets to with it saying, "If I had one,
yeah,
you would have it. I would give you the money, no problem, to basically get you out of here."
right.
So they keep trying, basically interrogating him.
So he's not
And then,
defying them. He's not belligerent.
no, in fact, believe it was said he was a kindly gentleman, was the quote.
Okay.
His exact quote was something to the degree of, "He was a kindly gentleman until I slit his throat," or "I thought he was a kindly gentleman until then." Um, so, after that, they go and they get Bonnie Clutter out of bed, and they bring her down to where the husband is at, and she tells him the same thing: "We haven't got a safe." And by now, Perry, being a little bit more, I think, of a savvy guy and a little bit more controlled, is starting to say, "Well, Dick, maybe they're telling the truth here. Maybe they really don't have a safe." But Hickok is adamant about it. So what do? They find out who else is in the house. They go and they wake up the 15-year-old, Kenyon Smith, the 15-year-old son, and bring him down there and, ostensibly
Hmm.
ask the same question. And still, Dick is on this kick about it. They have a safe, they have a safe, they have a safe. So they go and they get Nancy, 16-year-old Nancy Clutter,
Okay.
out of her room, bring her down, put them all in the bathroom, and I would assume she says the same thing. They haven't got a safe. And all the while, one of them is going through the house looking for money, looking for valuables. Um, and ultimately, all they found in the way of that was about $50, and then a pair of binoculars and a portable radio, which I'm not totally sure why you would take. I
Oh, to
mean, I would
listen,
think,
listen for the news.
what, but if you're there to rob, I mean, I would think that maybe Mrs.
Well, a
Clutter had
portable.
like a little bit of
So,
jewelry.
so this was again. What year was this? 40, 58, 59, right?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. This is 1950.
So a portable radio was kind of a valuable thing in those
Would
days.
it have been a higher dollar good?
Absolutely.
Something that could pawn? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. They were not all that
I
common
just,
in that at that time. Not until the space
uh huh.
program made the transistors cheap did they come down in price.
Well, there you go. I guess it's just weird to
Right. Well, I
think
mean,
that'd be the first thing they would grab. Maybe I would think maybe
it
like jewelry, like I said, maybe guns,
right.
or I don't know.
Well, a farmer would have had a shotgun at the very least.
Oh yeah, and absolutely would have had something
Yeah.
there. But yeah, they had them all in the bathroom, and Dick, according to Perry Smith's confession, during all this, is getting more and more frustrated. And you have to remember that Hickok basically brought Perry along because he thought, okay, if I have to have somebody killed,
Hmm.
this is the guy to do it.
Right.
So
He's got
ultimately,
experience.
right, right. So ultimately, what they do is they decide to segregate them.
Mm.
They take Bonnie back up to her bedroom, tie her up,
That's the daughter.
Nancy back up to hers.
Which one's?
Yeah,
Yeah, the mom and the daughter. Yeah, they. Okay.
yes. separate bedrooms, their bedrooms.
Okay.
And then after binding both of them, they have Herb Clutter in the cellar along with Kenyon, but again in different rooms down there.
Okay.
I think we had some pictures of that. Um,
I think it's
if we
time to
could.
trot those out.
Yeah. And ultimately, what they do is Perry Smith slits the throat of Herb Clutter, and then he hands the knife to Dick and says, Dick, you got to do your part now.
Mm.
But apparently, what Hickok did with that was just stuck the knife in the same hole that Perry had made.
Okay.
But but after that, Smith picks up the shotgun and ostensibly he says again in his confession that I picked it up to put him out of his misery
Mm.
because Herb hadn't died yet. And he shoots him. In fact, the quote with that, again, for it, he talked about seeing a flash of blue light and then seeing Herb's head explode.
Mm.
The house is dark. The only light at this juncture is flashlights they have. That's it.
Okay.
But they do that to Herb and then move along to Kenyon, who's also dead from one 12 gauge wound to his head.
Wow.
Then, according to Hickok's confession, up to Nancy's room. And she was interesting because she was the only one who was posed on her stomach and the back of her head. So she was shot basically execution style in her bed.
Wow.
All the others were face up. Um, and then they moved on and they did the same to Bonnie, but face up. And then they left, basically. $50 in their pocket. That was it.
And a radio.
And well, yeah, radio and binoculars. Um, it is interesting because their bodies were found on a morning by friends who were curious when nobody was answering at the house and nobody was. That is when they knocked on the door, nobody was answering,
Mm-hmm.
but cars were in the garage. And when they went over to another house that had a phone and tried calling in, nobody was answering. Um,
What day of the week was
so
this? Did this happen? I don't think you mentioned.
it's a Sunday when they found the bodies, Sunday the 15th.
All right, so it was a Saturday night. So
Hmm.
people might have missed him at church, for example.
Yes, that was a big thing with it. Um, and they ultimately decided that they were going to go into the back of the house. So they let them through that door. And
Mm-hmm.
a couple of the daughters of, I believe it was the Ewald family, was the name. The
Yeah.
father, Roy Ewald, had brought his two daughters over ostensibly to get the Clutters and go to church. Um, the daughters ultimately go in thinking, okay, maybe they're sleeping really hard.
Right.
Get their way up to Nancy's room. And they find blood splatter on the wall. And they find her in bed. They rush out and they go and they get the sheriff. And he walks through there. And to his credit, one of the first things that he decides to do is go and get a guy by the name of Alvin Dewey, who we have his picture in there. He was a church mate of Herb Clutter and the
Okay.
Clutter family, so he knew them personally. But he was also a detective with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation.
Oh,
So this guy,
man,
he
what a
knew
smart
stuff
move.
with him. Yeah,
I mean,
he's not a Keystone cop.
right.
Um, and he and evaluates the scene. And one of the things, one of the interesting observations I thought he had, and it's really as far as like the earlier uses. of what could be called a profiler's logic
Mm-hmm.
was looking at how Nancy was positioned. And so what Dewey reasoned was whoever did this
Yeah.
could look the rest of the family in the eye as they killed them, but they couldn't do that with her.
Hmm.
It had to be somebody who knew her or thought they knew her. And where that led them first was to her boyfriend, a guy by the name of Bobby Rupp, which, I'm sure with any
Right.
investigation, that's likely where it's going to go. Who
Absolutely.
knew him first?
Right.
But he was cleared because he had an alibi. But what's interesting is Dewey's logic there still applies if you look at Hickok and Smith, because Hickok later admitted in his confession
Yeah.
that he knew there was a girl there. And this
Oh,
guy has
cause
a
he worked
history
on the
of
because he worked
pedophilia.
there.
No, 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 no. He was talking to the other guy who worked there, and he knew they had a daughter.
Okay.
Hickok knew that. And come to find out, Mr. Hickok also has a history of pedophilia.
Oh.
One of his wives was 16 when he married her. And while he was with this wife, he knocked up a 13-year-old.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And he later said in his confession that basically the reason he kept pushing on the safe was because he knew the girl was there. That was his main drive for going.
Oh, he
Not,
wanted to see the girl, and oh, by the way, there's money.
yeah, basically.
Wow.
So I think you could argue ultimately this was not a robbery, it was a sex crime.
But
Because
nobody was raped, right?
no, he wanted to rape Nancy, but it was actually Perry who talked him out of it.
Hmm.
Perry, I don't know how much you can believe this part of it, but he said that he was ready to fight him if he tried to do that. I don't know
Well,
why you would,
even among criminals, there are,
a bit of a code of honor.
yeah. I mean, pedophiles are not thought of, even amongst criminals, are not well thought of, and
Oh, yeah,
rapists in general,
absolutely. I mean, they get a horrible time behind bars next to really just police who
right?
are behind bars. But yeah, that, ultimately became, I think, the real motive there. Um,
Oh, that's interesting. I
yeah,
hadn't heard that before.
yeah, and I don't think a lot of people really knew that. I mean, even when you had Truman Capote and Harper Lee
Hmm.
coming in to start their research for what would become In Cold Blood, um, basically the novel that started the American obsession with true crime, once you get down to it.
Right.
Uh, yeah, it was interesting. I didn't know that Capote and Harper Lee were actually neighbors in Alabama.
What?
Yeah, they grew up basically right next to each other
Oh,
in
that's
Alabama.
crazy.
Yeah, but and it also being shortly before she published her Pulitzer Prize winning novel To Kill a Mockingbird. Um, but they get there, and you know, Capote, he's kind of an abrasive guy. Um, for instance, he told Dewey, Alvin Dewey, when he first met him, that I don't care if the case is solved. I just want info.
Hmm.
And it's like, and to me, it's like, why are you going to say that to the lead investigator if you want info?
Well, because
Just
he's an
shut
asshole.
up about that part. Yeah,
Well, he
yeah,
spent a lot of time in New York, right?
yeah, yeah. And he also spent a lot of time on the gossip
Yeah.
pages of the various New York newspapers because of his exploits. Capote did, but
So
uh,
he was used to being abrasive and having it just be a matter of course.
uh, yeah. I mean, personally, I think as a journalist that sometimes you have to be a bit abrasive, but to me, it's a whole other level to be kind of stupid abrasive when you're telling the lead investigator you don't care if it's solved or not,
Yeah.
because it's kind of counterproductive to say that
Well, and it
once
doesn't make
you.
for a good story either. So
Yeah.
there's that. He should very much care if it gets solved because it's a better story that way.
Hmm.
So short-sighted in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, in a lot of ways. And yeah, Michelle says from what I understand, he wasn't really well received in Garden City and Holcomb. No, he
No.
wasn't. And Dewey, like I said, was rather turned off initially. But Capote and Harper Lee actually managed to sort of work their way into Dewey's good graces. Um, and because of that, they were ultimately with him when they got the call from Las Vegas PD that, hey, we see these two guys you've been looking for. And interestingly, the way that they were caught with that was kind of different because they were hitchhiking and driving all over the country. And ultimately, what they did when they when they hitchhiked from Mexico to Barstow, California, they had all the shit that they were carrying with them sent to themselves in
Oh,
Las Vegas.
they mailed it.
Yeah,
Okay.
they mailed it, and that was what tipped the police off.
Uh,
So
all right. So where did these guys go after the murders? What was their?
after I, well, like I said, really all over the country. They talked about being in Florida, South Carolina, and even down into Mexico. Phoenix was one. They stole a car in Iowa. Um, but ultimately, where they ended up when they were arrested was Vegas.
Okay. So this couldn't be considered the start of a spree killing because they weren't ever, considered for other murders around the country or anything, right?
Actually, in 2013, they alleged they were alleged to have been involved in murdering a family in Sarasota,
In where?
in Florida,
Oh,
Sarasota,
oh,
Florida.
Sarasota. Okay.
Yeah, and apparently they had enough probable cause to exhume the bodies of Perry
Really?
Smith and Dick Hickok. I was just bringing that article back up. It was one I saw on the Wall Street Journal.
So when they
But
exhumed him, were they after DNA?
I think so.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just looking to see if I could bring that back up because I didn't see if anything came of that. Whether they liked him and considered the case solved or what
In the
have you.
comments, Michelle says that she heard that there was not a match.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for your other contributions too throughout.
Yeah, and
Um,
Jesse in the comments, thanks for being a smartass.
yeah,
It's
we
what we come
appreciate
to
it.
expect.
But yeah, I mean, ultimately, you had like I said, a shrink who looked at both of them. The guilt was beyond question. So, what the defense's strategy had to be based pleading insanity for that. And the shrink who looked at him was, like I said, genuinely intrigued with Dick Hickok and his organic brain injury.
Hmm.
And I would guess that the diagnosis with something like that would be acquired psychopathy, which you don't see that often, but you do see, you know,
Right. Yeah, there has to be
to where,
some causal effect. I mean, something causes somebody to have that happen to them. It's not just something you grow into, for example. It's not
right.
like
Well,
not
and then
not typically like
acquire,
schizophrenia where you get to a certain age and it just happens to you.
right. And that would be the acquired part of that,
Right.
what you're saying. Yeah. Um, which he had those findings with Hickok. And then with Perry Smith, it was a little bit more interesting. He said that he had a paranoid streak and that, quote, his fantasy life bordered on delusion.
Hmm.
So essentially, what he said Perry Smith was a borderline psychotic. Um, but interestingly, with the trial, they got the shrink up on the stand, and the only question that the judge would allow them to ask was, "Did these guys know right and wrong when they committed the crime?"
Interesting.
And yeah, and so the shrink was forced to say, "With Dick Hickok, I believe he did. With Perry Smith, I'm not so sure." Was essentially his answer. So yeah, and that trial ultimately ended, and the jury was only out for 30 minutes and gave him the death penalty by hanging, which we actually have a picture of the gallows that both of them were hung on.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll be coming around in the slideshow in a second.
Yep.
So
But
how long were they, this was the kind of the this was before the big anti-death penalty and prisoner rights reforms started coming along. It when the distance between a sentence and a execution could be days in some cases.
initially, they had it set up for about 90 days after the verdict, which was 1960.
Okay.
Particularly Hickok, when he was behind
Oh, you got it.
wheels and the like, really invoked his rights with that.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it was April 14th, 1965, when both of them were hung.
So by today's standards, that's still pretty fast.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
5 years seems like nothing in the
And that's definitely
modern
pretty quick.
age. Hmm.
But yeah, yeah, I don't know if it would have even stretched out that long if it wasn't for him doing that writing.
So there's
So,
been a lot of media generated over this one case.
yes, starting with, like we said, Capote's book, really. Well, and the headlines of the day, too. Um, then in 1967 is when the first movie of that came out, the black and white movie with actually Robert Blake
Yes.
as Perry Smith,
And
which is interesting.
that's a pretty good match, I gotta say.
Well, you mean because of his
Physically,
attributes and how he
yeah,
looks? Oh yeah,
physically,
it's also a pretty good match because Blake himself was charged with murder
yeah.
in the 90s.
I
A
don't
charge
remember.
that I thought he got out of that. And
Let
he
me
was
let me
found
look
not
that
guilty.
up, but I remember it was a bit of a circus. Now, my understanding was that Robert Blake was a pretty smart fellow, pretty above average IQ,
Hmm.
and but his trial seemed to be a bit of a circus.
I would imagine um, on both of those counts, definitely. As it tends to be whenever there's a celebrity who is on trial, because that was what, the late 90s, early 2000s. By
2001, it looks
then,
like.
yeah. And by then, Blake had made his mark in Cold Blood, the lead character on Beretta
Yeah,
for
that's
years.
where most people know him from. He also did a cop movie, Electroglide in Blue, where he played a
Uh-huh.
motorcycle cop.
I have to watch that. I haven't seen that one. But yeah, you had that movie. You had this remake of In Cold Blood, which I honestly had never seen or heard of until
He was
um,
acquitted, by the way.
this.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I thought so. And then you had Capote with the late Philip Seymour Hoffman, which told the story of how they wrote and researched In Cold Blood.
I didn't know that To Kill a Mockingbird was connected to this case.
Yeah, yep. Harper Lee was the research assistant, basically, for Capote
Oh, I did not know that.
throughout. And, I wonder if she might have been a little bit more socially minded, I guess you could say,
Hmm.
than he was, maybe acting as a sort of bridge with that, as it were.
Ah.
Um, yeah, people on this show know a bit about my penchant for collecting old autographed books, and an autographed copy of In Cold Blood is one I've been after for a while. So we'll see if I ever manage to find one.
Yeah, there you go. That could be that could be a good find to get.
Oh, Michelle says one of Lee's characters was based on Capote, but she's not totally sure which one. That is a good question. I was just reading a bit about Harper Lee's lost novel the other day, too, which is interesting in and of itself. It's about a lawyer down in Alabama and a family which has a rather bizarre history of murder, suicide, and mayhem.
Okay.
Um, the family, I think, was pushing to get that released too, but they just never did.
Well, when things are left up to errors, a lot of errors occur.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm not sure about the dynamics from Harper Lee's estate with that either. But
Man,
I thought the family had a lot of the notes that she produced on it too.
if you've never been involved in inheritance, people get really weird.
Hmm.
They really do. People you think you know really well start acting very strange.
Oh, I am sure, man. I've never been involved in it myself, but I was just looking to see. Oh, here we go from the Guardian. I'll share the link in the chat.
Okay.
The real story behind Harper Lee's lost novel, because it was bizarre. I remember. Let's see. Like I said, I'm doing this with one hand, which I usually don't do because I'm having
No,
to
no, no, no.
hold
We
the
don't want to know.
phone, having to hold the phone and not use
Oh,
my headset like I usually do. So, yep, that is it. And you know, it's not really the most, and it's not really anywhere near the most disgusting or disturbing thing we've looked at on this show, but we should never forget what happened to these poor people.
no. And there, I saw a very long documentary series about this little girl from England who disappeared in Portugal.
Madeline McCann.
Yeah, and how, part of it talks about the case, but part of it also talks about the reaction to the case, the
Hmm.
media side of things, and how much the media got involved and worldwide and all this shit. And I remember one of the journalists made a comment that, trying to understand why does this case get attention and another case that seems very similar to it doesn't get attention.
Hmm.
And their take on it was it's not so much about the person, but how, but the story around how how things happen, what it's about what happens, the circumstances of what happens. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, you know, in this case, the girl was kidnapped out of her out of the condo while her family was just yards away. That's
Mm-hmm.
that's the compelling part. It's not that she was a little English girl, although that
Yeah.
doesn't hurt so much, but you know, it's a interesting story about what happened.
Yeah. And they looked at it from the human interest side more
Right.
than a lot of stuff,
And
which
so
I think
and so in this
Capote
case,
did somewhat too.
yeah, in this case, this is a God-fearing, church-going, salt of the earth family that just gets wiped out
Mm-hmm.
for no good reason. So that's the interesting part. It's
Mm-hmm.
it has a very similar thing to, it's why do we know about Valiska over
Mm-hmm.
other axe murders of the time? Why do we know about, or in Lizzie Borden?
Oh
You
yeah.
Some stories stick and others don't in the imagination of the reading public, the consumer side of things. It
Mm-hmm.
needs it needs a hook that gets people interested, and it's not so much the people, generally speaking, when we're not talking about famous people. It's about
Mm-hmm.
how they went missing, how they died,
Mm-hmm.
and that's
Or in especially this case too, the utter senselessness
right,
of it
right,
when there wasn't even a safe there, you know.
exactly,
But
exactly. It's the strength of the story that makes one case capture the imagination of the public versus another one.
hmm,
Um,
absolutely. And of course, it doesn't hurt that mass media at that time. This is when people started buying and tuning into TVs a lot more.
it was still ramping up. Um,
Hmm.
I know my family, of course, we didn't have a lot of money. It took us quite a while to after into the 60s before we got a television. But but it was a growing phenomena at the
Hmm.
time, and that helped for sure. Radio was going gangbusters still.
Yep, absolutely. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I hope it's never forgotten by people. For anybody who gets it, the Sundance Channel. I personally watch mine through my Amazon Prime account,
Hmm.
but on the Sundance Channel, they have a rather interesting series that was done by Joe Berlinger of Paradise Lost fame. That's
Okay,
called Cold Blooded, and
okay.
it's all about it. So
I've seen the '90s era miniseries
I
of the
wonder
same
if that
title.
was the other one that I posted. Was that with Sam Neill?
Yes,
Okay, that was the poster that I got. Okay.
and that is available on Prime.
Hmm. Is it a good watch compared to the
You,
original?
it's been a while since I've seen either one of them, but I
Hmm.
remember I remember liking them pretty well. Yeah. Anthony
Oh,
Edwards, I think, is one of I think he plays Smith.
I like him. He's a good actor, but
Yeah.
I really liked him like in Zodiac as a cop.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, and the original is pretty impeccable in my opinion.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and like I said, I haven't seen
I
the
think I think it let
one.
I think black and white was the right call for that one too.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yep. Richard Brooks, the director of that one.
All right. Anything else to add for this?
Um, Yeah, I think we pretty much covered it. I don't know if Michelle had anything else with that. Yeah, I like the original better too. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robert Blake, he was a heck of an actor. Uh, well,
You know what? Getting off a bit on a tangent. You know what movie he's excellent in my opinion,
what's that?
and I might be kind of crucified for it.
Uh-oh.
David Lynch's Lost Highway.
Oh, God, Lynch is such a weirdo.
Robert Blake is perfect as the mystery man in that, but um, yeah, you're definitely right, Michelle. It won't be forgotten around
No,
there, or I think in a lot of small towns, it still reverberates with people.
well,
Thank you for your contributions to having somebody who was a local and also worked in journalism in the area.
yeah,
Has talked to
that
people
was really
about it.
nice.
Um, yeah, and we really appreciate you listening and contributing to that end. Uh,
Okay, I think
yeah,
we'll call this one good for
I
tonight.
think so.
Tune in next week. We'll have some more mayhem for you.
Yep, when we figure out our topic for then,
All
which we
right.
haven't done yet.
No, we haven't yet. We'll find something. I don't think we've run
We
out
will.
yet.
No. Nope, shan't be a problem. Good
All
night,
right.
all.
Good night.